We are about 6 lines from the top of Samach Tes Amud Aleph. Just for the record, I want to say today is once the Shabbos Parshas Toldos, the day of my son Menachem's Oifruf, is Parshas Toldos, and Bez Hashem is going to be on Wednesday, which is the day of Vov Kislev going into Zayin Kislev. Zok the Heilige Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak said, Shemaiti, I heard two halachas about two cases, but I don't know which halacha applies to which case. Shemati Shtayim. Achas Kemitza Sor. One was related to a Zor who did Kemitza on a mincha. The Achas Malika Zor, a Zor who made Malika on a oif, on the korban of oif. And I learned that Achas Teirid, one is so possible that even if it was mistakenly placed on the Mizbeach, of course, you're not supposed to put on the Mizbeach, it's a possible korban. But if it was mistakenly put on the Mizbeach, Teirid, you got to take it off. The echos loiserid. The other one, I guess, is not so possible. So if you put it on the Mizbeach, you would leave it there. But v'lo yodana, for the life of me, I don't remember which is which. Amar Chizkiah. So Chizkiah said, "I'll tell you which is which." Mistavra Kemitza Teirid. Kemitza is the one that's so off base that you don't even leave it on the Mizbeach if it was got there by mistake. And Malika loiserid. Fact Gemara, why would you make such a distinction? Maishna, Malika, why do you say that Malika has a shaykhis, and therefore it has a shaykhis to a kosher process, and therefore you should leave it on the Mizbeach? Yeshnei bebama. You find that oifos that were brought on bamos, they were allowed to be processed through Yisrael, which means even though Yisrael could have done Malika. So that gives it sort of a validity, and that's why if in the base of Mikdash, Azor made Malika, if a zoivite, it would be enough that im ola terid. But Kemitza has the same symptoms. Kemitza nami yesh no b'bama. And when a mincha was brought at the bama, a Yisrael as well was allowed to do Kemitza. V'chitema ein mincha b'bama. And if you were going to say they didn't bring a carbon menachos in the bama, how could you tell me Azor was kosher? They never even brought a carbon mincha in the bama. Well, if you're going to say that, then I'm going to respond ein oifos nami b'bama. Because whether or not you're allowed to be makrav mincha on a bama is learned from the same pasuk that tells you that you're not allowed to be makrav a noiv on a bama. The Amar B'Sheshes l'divrei Amar yesh mincha b'bama yesh oivos b'bama, and l'divrei Amar ein mincha ein oivos, because they're learned from the same pasuk. My timer, it says in the pasuk in reference to bama, this was Klal Yisrael bringing karbanos. In the midbar, it says Vayishlach es nari b'nei Yisrael v'yalu oilos v'yizbechu Zevachim, and we dash in Zevachim v'loy menachos, Zevachim v'loy oifos. So you cannot make a distinction. So you're going to, in order to say that Malika is good, you'll have to say that Sai Zevachim, Sai oifos, and Sai menachos were brought on the bama, and in fact, Azor was able to bring it. So how could you make a distinction between the two? Zok Gemara. You can't bring a raya from the fact that a Zor made Kemitza on a bama that in the Beis HaMikdash it would work as well, because it was a completely different process. The mincha process on the bama was completely different from the mincha process in the Beis HaMikdash. Yes, they were makar menachos in the bama, but you can't bring a raya from there because it was a different process. Now we know that when someone brings a mincha, he puts the whole mixture into a klei sharis and is mekadosh it. Then the kohen makes kemitza, and he puts the kemitza into a second klei sharis. That was not required at all by the bama. So it's a different process. So from the fact that by the midbar, by the bama, it was ksher bizarre, the kemitza was ksher bizarre, doesn't mean anything, doesn't prove anything, lagabi the kemitza in the Beis HaMikdash. But the fact that by the bama, Malika was ksher bizarre, which is the same avodah that's done in the Beis HaMikdash, therefore, we'll say that if a Malika is done bizarre, even though it's a possible carbon, im Allah lo yerid. Beautiful. Zok the Heilige Mishnah weiter. Molak b'smoiloi b'layla. Now, that's not what the Gemara is looking for makar for. The Gemara is looking for makar that Malika shahi lefnim. Because if you look at the Mishnah inside, the Mishnah lists off Molak b'smoiloi b'layla. Shachet chulin b'fnim, b'kotshim b'chutz, ein metamos b'beis habliya. So these are all things that are not metamos b'beis habliya. So the Gemara ended up saying that the zehaklal is marba some other things. What is the Zeklal marba? We actually had right on top of our Umud. Zeklal was marba Shechitas kachim b'fnim, meaning you shechted an oif b'fnim. And okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. Molak b'smol b'lai. Taner yochol tehei melika shehila fnim mitama begodim bebeis abliya. It's actually not referring to that. It's a new thing. Now, malika shi b'fnim, you would think it's mitama begodim bebeis abliya. Now, if you made a kosher malika on a kosher carbon, why would it be mitama begodim bebeis abliya? So we're going to see Rashi learns very mechudishtik. He's going to tell us very shortly that really malika is an avela. It's not a shechita. But there's a gzeres hakosov by the chatas that the kohen can eat it. So that's not an avela. But no one says that you can eat an oila. The oila has to be burnt on the mizbeach. So Rashi actually says that an oilas oif is an avela. So if you're not allowed to eat it, but if you ate it, you'd be tamei b'veis abliya, just like nevela seif tar. Yochal te malika shilafnim mitame begodim b'veis abliya. And of course, other Rishonim learn it was a malika that went wrong. Talmud loymar nevela. Let's have a look where it says nevela. It's talking about nevelas oif tar. The pasuk that talks about nevelas oif tar says as follows: V'chol nefesh asher toichal nevela utreifa be'ezrach uvager. So it's a tumah that you only get by eating. We know that applies to noif tar, to nevelas oif tar. V'chibes begod v'rachotz b'mayim v'tomei adar. So it says nevela. Yochal te malika shilafnim mitama begodim bebeis abliya tabalor min nevela. So this is not a nevela. Why? Because you did malika. Frank, what do you mean it's not a nevela? Hanami nevela. Of course it's a nevela. It didn't have a proper shechita. This is the Rashi. So Rashi man le malach lav nevela. Who said this because a kosher or malika was done that it's not a nevela? Nida hutra malika's chatas ha'oif l'kay hanim migzeres hakosov milachol chatosam kida amran beperek beishamai. But oila shalai hutra lahem. There is no place where it says anybody could eat it. It's burnt on the mizbeach. Tit mabebeis abliya. If someone ate it, he'll be tamei. It's a massive chiddush. We're saying even though it's a kosher malika, it's not going to be mitarma tamasa. Again, other Rishonim learn it means it was a malika psula. Ela Talmud loymer treifa. It says v'chol nefesh asher toichal nevela utreifa. Why would it say treifa? Think about it. Why would it say treifa? So Rashi takes us through the Gemara later. There's different ways to learn this pasuk. Now, you could learn the simplest, most obvious shot of this pasuk is v'chol nefesh asher toichal nevela utreifa. What is a treifa? A treifa means a treifa sheshachta, right? So maybe what the pasuk is telling you that not only is a nevelas oif tahar tamei bebeis abliya, but maybe even a treifas oif tahar is mitama bebeis abliya, meaning shechting the oif tahar does not mitar the treifa mitamasa. Now we're going to shortly learn at the bottom of the Amud we have a new Mishnah that's going to have a three-way machlokes. What's the deal with birds that are treifas? So one shita on the extreme is Reb Meir. Reb Meir holds not only will a shchita be mitaher a treifa from nevela, but a malika as well will. And Reb Yehuda is the other extreme. He holds even a shchita will not be mitaher the oif from tuma. So the way Rabbi Yehuda would learn this pasuk is very simple. V'chol nefesh asher toichal nevela treifa. If you ate a nevela, or even if it was a shechuta, but it was a treifa, you'll be tummy. That fits in perfectly according to Rabbi Yehuda. But Reb Meir can't darshan that way because Reb Meir actually learns that a treifa bird sheshachta would not be tummy. So what does utreifa mean according to Reb Meir? That's what the Gemara is probing. Zok the Gemara, according to Reb Meir, the reason why it sticks in the word treifa is to tell us, as a treifa, we learn from here, ma treifa she'ein materes as a iser. When an animal becomes treifa, it doesn't benefit anything. It's also right. So treifa mu'urba mater she'ein treifa is mu'urba mater shum iser shoyba mitchila. Becoming a treifa does not help in any which way. Av kol, so too, the only type of condition that will make an oif tahar tame is if it goes through a process of kol she'ein materes esa iser. If there's a process that's not matter any isurim that this bird goes through, that dies through, then it will be metama. Yotza malika, but a malika sheilafnim. If you did a malika b'fnim, even if it was a possible malika, it does impact. It does improve the condition of this bird. You know why? Hoyel v'materes esa iser. It's matter and iser. What iser is it matter? What the iser that it's matter is if you made a malika b'fnim, even though it was possible, we know the halacha is im olu lo yerdu. If it was put onto the mizbech by mistake, it doesn't come off. So you see the malika had a positive impact on this bird. Once there's a process on it that has a positive impact, it's no longer a nevela that's similar to treifa. And therefore, such a bird would not be tamei basically. So therefore, yotza malika sheilafnim, hoil v'hi materes esa iser, ein metame begodim bebeis. It will not have that special tumah of tumas nevelas oif tar, because once malika was done, even if it was a partial malika, it improved the carbon, it makes it im olu lo yerdu, and therefore it won't create a tumah. Gewaltig. Zok to Gemara, maybe ovi I should also include in the category of birds that died that are not tamei bebeis abliya, hamoilek hachim b'chutz. Maybe it should also include moilek hachim b'chutz and moilek chulin bein mi b'fnim bein mi b'chutz, and those we know are tamei tumas nevela. Let's have a look over here. The Gemara says leisuye malikas chulin b'chutz, that it's tamei. But even Malikas Kachim B'chutz, I believe the Mishnah says, I believe it says over there somewhere. Let me see if I can find it in the Mishnah. Molek Chulim B'fnim, the Kachim B'chutz. Mishnah list is black and white. It's Metama B'beis Abliya. But Zok to Gemara, because of the fact that if the malika has some positive impact, we should say that it's not mitama bebeis abliya. So then maybe avi hamoyle kachim b'chutz umoyle chulam beim b'fnim beim b'chutz. I'm sorry, I'm wrong. Hoil ve'ein matir in esa iser. They're not matter any iser at all. So if I care, the Gemara is not asking a kasha. The Gemara is saying if you were moyle kachim b'fnim, where there is a positive impact from the malika, there it won't be metama like a nevelas oiftar, the base of bliya. But if you moilek hachim b'chutz or moilek chulam beim b'chutz, which the Mishnah says does nothing at all, and im olu yerdu, they're completely possible malikas. Hoil bein matirnes iser, since they're not matter any iser whatsoever on this word, therefore they're like they're a nevela that's like a treifa, which was our limud, and therefore metamin begodim abeis abliya. So we have a makar why melikas kachim b'fnim will not be metamin bebeis abliya, and why melikas kachim b'chutz and melikas chulin bein b'fnim bein b'chutz will be metamin bebeis abliya. Tanya idach, we had another brisa. Yochol tehei shechitas chulin lefnim. You would have thought that if I shechted chulin lefnim, and we're talking about oifos over here, you shechted an oif of chulin in the base of English, or v'kachim bein mi b'fnim bein mi b'chutz, you would have thought that they're metama abeis abliya. Talmud loymar nevela. So the Gemara asks the same question. Hanami nevelahi. These are also nevelas, because since they're undergoing a process that's not authorized, so they become possible. So therefore, maybe they should be metama. Ella Talmud Lemer Treifa. Again, we're focusing on the extra word treifa that doesn't belong there, and we say that the word treifa is there to help us understand what type of nevela is metama bebliya and what type of nevela isn't. And we learn ma treifa shava b'fnim kibachutz. The situation, the psak of a bird whether this occurred in the Beis Hamikdash or out of the Beis Hamikdash, the halacha would be the same. A treifa, doesn't matter if you shechted a treifa b'fnim or b'chutz, it's still a treifa, it's still aser. Therefore, avkol, the only type of animals that will be tamei b'beis habliya, the only type of nevelas oif tahars that will be tamei b'beis habliya are only those oif tahars that are shavos b'fnim kibchutz. So let's see how the chips fall now. Yotza shechitas chulin b'fnim. Shechitas chulin b'fnim, you cannot say it's shava pnim and chutz, because shechitas chulin b'chutz is a very perfect shechita. So therefore, even shechitas chulin b'fnim, even though it's nevela, it will not be metama, the tumas nevela seiftar. You know what else is not the same of pnim and chutz? V'kachim bein mi b'fnim, bein mi b'chutz, which sounds a little bit funny because it seems like they do have the same status. Hoil v'loy shavu b'fnim kibchutz, since the pnim is different than the chutz, we'll say that they are not going to be metama beis habliya, ein metamen begadim beis habliya. Frag the Gemara, b'shleima chulin, I understand why it's lo shavu b'fnim kibchutz, because if you shachted chulin b'chutz, that's a beautiful kosher shechita. Elakachim idi v'idi psulim. If you shecht chachim, you didn't make a malika, you shechted a bird, it doesn't make a difference if you shechted it in the Beis Hamikdash or out of the Beis Hamikdash, they're both possible. So it fits the description that if it's shabbat b'fnimu b'chutz, it should be metama b'beis habliya. Omarava, you couldn't possibly say that shechting chachim b'chutz would be metama b'beis habliya. Because if you shecht chachim b'chutz, if you shecht normally if you shecht chachim b'chutz, you're chayav kares. What if you shechted an oif tar chachim b'chutz? You didn't do malika, you did shchita. Would you be chayav kares there? Zok Rava, imay ila loy shchita schutz lechayav kares. Person would be chayav kares for this malika, for this shchita. So you can't do the shchita did nothing at all. This shchita of the oif b'chutz had a major impact. It was mechayav a guy kares. So surely loy soya loy litahira midei nevela. You see, this shchita had an impact. It might not have been such a good impact, but it had an impact. So we obviously consider it that some type of a shchita was done on this bird. So oibazoi, that's good enough of a reason why it shouldn't be tamei as nevelas oiv tamei, as nevelas oiv tar. Okay, you have a good reason to say that if you shechted an oif, a carbon, an oif tar, chutz l'beis hamikdash, why it's not tamei. I get it. But penim minalam, how do you know that if you shechted a bird inside, there the malika doesn't seem to do anything at all? So if that's the case, why don't you say that it's metama b'beis habliya? Because if you did, well, the problem is, either way, either shchita, sai b'fnim, sai b'chutz, you cannot say is metama, because it needs to be parallel b'fnim k'b'chutz, and they have a different halacha. B'chutz you're chayav kares, and b'chutz you're not going to be metama b'beis habliya. If you're going to say b'fnim is metama b'beis habliya, then it's lo shavu. So therefore, anyway, it can't be metama b'beis habliya. So Zok the Gemara, based on your logic, I'm going to ask you a question. Ihachi malak hachim b'chutz. We know malak hachim b'chutz for sure is metama b'beis habliya. But the problem is, if you made malikas kachim b'fnim, that would be perfect. Malikas kachim b'fnim is precisely what you're supposed to do. So it's not shava b'fnim u'b'chutz. Malak kachim b'chutz nami loy should not be tamei b'beis habliya like a nevela. The loy shava b'fnim k'b'chutz, because if you did it outside, it's possible. If you do it inside, it's a textbook process. Amar Absimi Barashi, you can't ask me such a kasha. Because Donin Davar Shaloi Bechshere, Midavar Shaloi Bechshere. When you're comparing two things, you have to compare something that was not done properly to something else that was not done properly, and there you have to say they have the same halacha. But no one's going to suggest that a malika b'fnim is going to be compared to a malika b'chutz when one is doing it the proper way and one is not. The limit that we have is they have to have the same halacha inside and outside, meaning, but in a similar scenario where they weren't done properly, where there's a psul involved. So therefore, from malika kachim b'chutz, you can't ask me a kasha. So therefore, malika you can't learn. But in our sugya, where we're talking about shechitas Oif b'fnim and b'chutz, that works out good because shchita is possible sai b'fnim and sai b'chutz because malika is what is required. Correct, Gemara. So you have this rule now that you never can bring any raya from something that was done properly to something that wasn't done properly. I'm going to show you a raya where the brisa brings a raya from something that was done properly to something that's not done properly. Correct, Gemara. Tanya we learned, we know this brisa, we learned it several times. How do you know that if you have a carbon that left Azara, so now it's possible to Yosy? What if it came back in? Still possible, you're not supposed to put it on the Mizbech, but Shem Allah, if you put it on the Mizbech by mistake, Lo Yered, you don't take it off. Zok to Bryce, you know how you know that? Shara Yosy kosher babam. By a bama, Yosy is kosher. You know why? Because there's no such thing as Yosy. Because there's no borders to a bama. So you see clearly, we're bringing a raya from Yosy b'bama, which there's no such thing, there's no such psul, meaning it was done properly, to a case where it was Yosy and it wasn't done properly. So you see, you could bring such a raya. Zok Gemara, that reason is not really the reason why Yosy im Allah le'evet. The real reason is there's a xeris akosik. There's a pasuk. The svara is not really the real reason. Tana azois Teiras oila. Those three words were darshaned to teach us. One of the things it taught us is that a Yosy im Allah le'evet. Riba, the riba from zois Teiras oila, samachli is what he's relying on. But in fact, we maintain our position that you cannot bring a raya from something that's done properly to something that wasn't done properly. About exakt ahiliga mishnah weiter. Malak v'nimsas treifa are three-way machlokes that we discussed earlier. They made a malika, and it turns out the bird was a treifa. Will the malika? We know for sure a behema that is a treifa that was shechted is not going to be tamei to mustavela. We have psukim that teaches that by a behema, shchita always is matar a treifa from tumah. But what about a bird?
Does a treifa need a shechita? I'm not sure if I
eat it anyway. But if you want to avoid it becoming tamei, then you shecht it. Because if you let it just drop dead, then it will become an avela.
So you shecht in this way, it's not an avela, and then you can't eat it, or you could eat it?
You still can't eat it. It's a treifa, but at least it's not tamei.
Right, okay.
So nowadays, when we're all tamei, there would be no benefit in that. But unfortunately, they don't usually know before they check an animal if there was a treifa or not. Because they have to check the stuff that's inside.
Right.
So Zokmar Molak v'nimtzas treifa. If Meir Aimer, einay mitame b'veis abliya. An oif that was done b'malika properly, and it turned out being a treifa, the malika, just like the shchita of a behemoth that's a treifa, says that there's no tumah here. Kol shekain, if you made a shchita of an oif of chulin, and it turned out that it was a treifa, kol shekain, that wouldn't be tumah. Okay, we talk to Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda has the opposite extreme. Rabbi Yehuda remember tamei. Not only if you made malika on an oif that was a treifa, is it tamei? But even if you made a shchita on an oif that was a treifa, it would be tamei. Amar Reb Meir kal v'chomer. I actually have a kal v'chomer to prove my point that in fact shchita on an oif tahar would be mitayr its treifa from tumus nevela. And here's the simple kal v'chomer. Im nevelas behema. The nevela of a behema is a very severe, stringent tumah. Well, how do I know that? Shemitama b'magu v'masa. Merely touching it makes the person who touches it, or even just carrying it who didn't touch it, tamei, it makes him tamei. Nevertheless, shechitasa mitaheres treifasa mitamasa. We have psukim that tell us that if you shechted it, it won't be tamei. So nevelas ha'oif, which is such a shvacha tumah, you know why? Because touching it doesn't make you tamei. You actually have to eat it to become tamei. She'nitam b'magu v'masa. Einoi din shetei shechitasai mitarosai treifasai mitamasai. Surely it should. So from this kal v'chomer we know that the shechita of an oif that's treifa, an oif tahar that's treifa, will be mitared from tumah. And the Gemara is going to ask Rabbi Yehuda, how could you argue with the kal v'chomer? It's one of the shloisha asad dvarim shatar in the dreshes ben. Now, how do you know malika? Malika, I take what I learned through a Kal V'chomer, and through a Mamatzinu, I apply it to Malika. Mamatzinu, we have a similarity. B'shchitas ha'ishim machsharas. Shchita has a good feature. It's a machshar, an animal. La'achila. And another feature of the shchita is umitaheres treifas and mitumasei. So af melikasai, which shares a feature with shchita, shehi machsharasai ba'achila. When it's a carbon, it's machshared ba'achila. So therefore, it should also share the feature titayer treifasai midei tumasei. Nice kal v'chomer. Rabbi Yosy comes up the middle. He says, "I'll agree with you because of your kal v'chomer that the shchita of an oiftar will protect it from becoming tamei, even though it's a treifa, but malika will not work." So Rabbi Yosy Omer, dayoi kenivlas behema shchitas mitarasa v'loy malikas. Zok Rabbi Yosy, if the whole nikar of shchita being mitayr is a behema, and by behema that concept only applies to shchita, not malika, you can't learn through a kal v'chomer that by oif even malika will do it, because there's a concept, a rule in kal v'chomers called dayoy lavay minadin liyos kanidain. If you're learning B from A through a kal v'chomer, you could definitely not say that B will have more features than A. B could not have more than A. Fragt Gemara, Reb Meir leidarish dayoy. Reb Meir can't argue with the dayoy. So how does Reb Meir use the memetinu to add malika to the list of things that are mitar mitamasei? V'dayoy dayraisahu. Dayoy is a deraisa. You know where we know it? We know it from the story of Miriam. Titania midin kal v'chomer. From the rules of the kal v'chomer are ketzad. Yomer Hashem al Moshe v'yavia yorek yorak b'fanea. If her father would spit in her face from humiliation, she would hide herself for 7 days. Kal v'chomer l'shchina arba'at hayoy. Logic would say that if the shchina spits in her in the face, which is what the equivalent of taras is, she should have to hide for 14 days. But that's not what Moshe said. Moshe said only 7 days. Why? If the whole makar of the kal v'chomer is a father and he's 7 days, you can't apply more than 7 days to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Interesting enough, the early Achronim or even the late Rishonim say that the shloisha asher midos shatar nidreshes behen are keneged the shloisha asher midos of Hashem. Hashem karach m'chanan. And one of the Chassidish Sfarim say that the kal v'chomer is keneged the midah of kale, and that's why when Miriam got her einish and she got it through a kal v'chomer, what was Moshe's tefillah? We say it in Yedid Nefesh. Kale da rafan Allah. Moshe was appealing to the name kale because that's the name that's associated with the kal v'chomer. Omer Rabbi Yosef Reb Avin. Reb Meir Kro Ashkach the Kadarish. You're right. There is a dayoy, and therefore from the kal v'chomer, Reb Meir wouldn't be able to extend it to malika. But he found the pasuk, and the pasuk says as follows. It says, "Zois toyas habehema ba'oif v'chol nefesh echaya haraymeses b'mayim u'l'chol hasheretzes aloretz." It's talking about hilchos tumah v'tahira, and the Torah compares the tumah v'tahira of a behema to an oif. Frank the Gemara. In what universe is the behema and oif similar in halacha? The oif the behema. Think about it. Behema mitama b'magu v'masa. Oif enu mitama b'magu v'masa. Oif mitama b'godim abeis abliya. Behema enu mitama b'godim abeis abliya. They have nothing in common. So why is the Torah putting them together? Eloloi malach to teach us the following chiddush. Ma behema. Just like a behema. Whatever the process is to be machshir lachila, in the case of the behemoth, that means a shchita. Mitar treifa samitamasa will be mitar treifa and the one allowed to become tamei. Af oiv, so to the oiv, davar shemachshir b'achila, anything that will be machshir b'achila. Sai shchita for chulin, sai belika for hektish. Mitar treifasei mitumasai. So in fact, it's not a kal v'chomer, it's a hekesh. And that's how Reb Meir knows that Sai Malika and Sai Shchita will be mitar in the Velas Oifta. If it was a Treifa. So it's not a Nevela. It stops it from becoming a Nevela. For Rabbi Yehuda, my timer, how could Rabbi Yehuda ignore the kal v'chomer, at least for Shchita Soif, there's a kal v'chomer. How could he ignore the Kalvachimer? So it's where he also has a pasuk. Ra ashkach v'kadarash. He found the pasuk that he darshans. It says in the pasuk, "V'chol nefesh asher toichel nevela utreifa." This is the pasuk. This is the pasuk that we darshaned on Amud Aleph, the pasuk that talks about nevelas oiftahar. The way he darshans it is as follows: Nevela utreifa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Treifa Lam and Emra. Right, the same question we had on Amud Aleph. Why does it Treifa? Nevela includes it all because mimanavshin. And Treifa chaya, if a Treifa is considered a live animal and then it dropped dead, well, that's a Nevela. Hari Nevela Amura. And in Treifa Einachaya, if a Treifa is already considered dead, so then it's a Nevela before anything happens to it. Hari Bechal Nevela. So why in the world did the Torah list off Nevela Utreifa? Treifa is completely redundant. Ela lahavi Treifa sheshachta. It teaches us that if you shechted a Treifa, shemetama, it will also be tame. So Rabbi Yehuda learns this utreifa to teach us that if you shechted a Treifa, it will be tame. If you remember on Amud Aleph, we said Rav Meir doesn't learn that way. So what did Rav Meir do with the word utreifa? So if we could quickly turn back, we'll remind ourselves. He learns from that word utreifa to tell us ma treifa she'ein materes esa iser avkol she'ein materes esa iser. The only type of killing a bird that would become tameh b'beis habliyah is if the way to kill it didn't impact it positively in any way. But a malika b'fnim, because we said it makes it that a ma'alul yardu, it impacted positively the carbon, therefore it's not going to be metameh b'beis habliyah. We had another limud of nevelu treifa that wouldn't fit in with Rabbi Yehuda, and that is ma treifa shava b'fnim k'bechutz, av kol shava is b'fnim k'bechutz, yotzer shchitas chulu b'fnim, v'kachim bein b'fnim ein b'chutz. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't learn like this. Rabbi Yehuda uses this to treifa to tell you a different halach, that if a bird is a treifa and you shechted it, it will still be tameh. So how will Rabbi Yehuda know the things that Rav Meir learned from this pasuk? That's something that the Gemara is going to get to tomorrow. So zog to Gemara weiter. Omer lei Rab Shizbi. Rab Shizbi told him, Elamayata, if that's how you're learning, that when it says nevela utreifa, it's telling you that even if you made a shechita on the treifa, it's still going to be tameh. Well, let's see how this method of analysis fits in another psukim in the Torah. It says in the pasuk, "V'chelav nevela, v'chelav treifa." The chelav of a nevela and the chelav of a treifa, the yasa l'chol mulacha v'chol oisuchu. We learn from there that it's not tameh. And the basar of a behema that's a nevela is tameh. But the chelav of a nevela is not tameh. It's a chiddush, right? Why shouldn't it be tameh? It's a nevela. But there's a chiddush in the pasuk that the chelav of a nevela and the chelav of a treifa are not tameh. So are you going to learn the same way? The chelav nevela, the chelav treifa. So are you going to learn that the same way? Hasam nami nema treifa chaya hari nevela amura. Treifa eina chaya hari b'chal nevela. So it can't be telling you that the chelav of a treifa is tar, because of the same argument you made when we're talking about the vela seif tar. Ella, you know what this pasuk must be doing? Ella lahavi treifa sheshachta. It must be telling you that a treifa sheshachta, which is exactly how you wanted to learn the pasuk by oif the vela seif tar, shechelba tar. It's telling you that a treifa sheshachta will be just like an avela, and its chelav will be tar. Now let's talk about this for a second. If you have a behema kshera, you have a cow, and it became an avela. So we know the meat is tameh, right? But the Torah tells us that its chelav is tar. Now you want to say that we learn from the chelav treifa that if you shechted a treifa, its chelav would be tar. Well, if the Torah is telling us that its chelav is tar, obviously, just like the nevela, the basar will be tameh. Mechlal dimatama. So that means you're telling me that if you shechted a treifa, the chelav will be tar and the basar will be tameh. Is that what you want to tell me? Via Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav. We have a brisa that supports this. we have a limit from a pasuk to tell us that's not the case. It says v'chiyamus mina behema. Not all behemoths become nevelos that are tamei. It says v'chiyamus mina behema asher hilochem la'achla and the gave of loss yitmadar. So not all behemoths are tamei if they're nevelos. Only some. So which are, which aren't? Miktas behema matama. Miktas behema ain't matama. Veizoi. Which one? Which one is not tamei? Zu treifa sheshachta. So we know kula al mamoida a treifa sheshachta. The basar would not be tamei. We're talking about a behema here. Kula al mamoida that a treifa sheshachta the basar would not be tamei. So the way you're learning the pasuk, the diak should be the dafka the chelev should not be tamei, but the basar should be tamei. So you can't learn the pasuk that way. So how are you going to be forced to explain the pasuk of a chelev nevela, a chelev treifa? Ella, what you're going to have to say is treifa mi boyele lemute tmeya. It says the chelev nevela chelev treifa. This only applies to a kosher animal. But if it was a donkey or a horse that died, everything would be tamei. And how do you know that? Because you know it from saying mi sheyesh bimina treifa. Only the type of animal that has the isser of treifa, which is a kosher animal, that's only usher if it becomes a treifa. Yosy sazu, but a horse or a donkey, change b'mina treifa. You don't have the isser treifa because even if it's a perfect condition, it's tamei to you. So you must learn that the chelev nevela, the chelev treifa is telling you a chiddush that this halacha that the chelev is tahor only applies to the nevela of a behema tahira, but the nevela of a behema tamei, a camel, a chamar, a horse, there even the chelev will be tamei. That's how you're forced to learn that shot in this pasuk. But if you're doing that, then you can learn the same shot in the pasuk of nevelas iftar. Not that a treifa sheshachta will be tamei, rather hachanami lemute of tamei shein b'mina treifa. When do you say a nevelas iftar is mitame bebeis abliya? That's a nevelas iftar. Who, if it's treifa, you can't eat it. If it's not treifa, you could eat it. But a nevelas iftamei, which you wouldn't be able to eat the basar regardless, who doesn't have it in treifa, it doesn't have the halacha of tumah bebeis abliya. That's how you learn this pasuk. So the problem is, how does Rabbi Yehuda learn from this pasuk v'chol nefesh that even a treifa sheshachta, an oif treifa sheshachta, would be tamei? We needed to tell you that the nevela of an oif tamei is going to be tamei with a regular tamei and not the beis habliya. Zok Gemara, you're right. That is how he would have to learn pshat of that pasuk. But the chiddush that you want to extract from the pasuk that the nevelas oif tamei is not tamei beis habliya like by an oif tar, Rabbi Yehuda already knows it from a different pasuk. So these words, the chol nefesh is nevelas, are still extra. Where does Rabbi Yehuda know that the halacha of tumah beis habliya does not apply to the nevela of an oif tamei? Rabbi Yehuda min nevela nafkale. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer yochol tei nevelas oif tamei mitama begadim beis habliya. I would have thought that this pasuk of a chol nefesh techol nevela applies equally to an oif tamei. Talmud loimer nevela utreifa lo yochel. This is a different pasuk. It says nevela utreifa lo yochel litamava ani Hashem. So we learn what type of nevela has a tumah. Misha isurai mishum bal toichel nevela. Only birds that have or animals that are aser because of the isur nevela. Yotzazeh an oiv tamei shein isurai mishum bal toichel nevela. It's not aser because nevela. And mishum bal toichel tamei, it does not have the din tumah of the nevelas oiv tar. So now I know that Allah already that the parsha of Tumas Beis Habliya of nevelas iftar doesn't apply to a nevelas iftamei. So back to the drawing board. What is it teaching you? It must be teaching you that even a treifa sheshachta, the bird will be tamei bebeis habliya. Baruch Hashem, we were zeicher to finish Daf Samachtas, and Beis Hashem tomorrow we will learn Daf Ayin, and even though Daf Ayin is also a difficult blot, but I'm going to turn to Daf Ayin Aleph, and you're going to see that an Ayin Aleph gets considerably, I don't know, easier, but considerably shorter because it's only a 2-line Amud Aleph. Again, it's probably a difficult 2 lines, but that's somewhat reassuring. And even Amud Beis isn't too long, so even if we have trouble tomorrow finishing, we always have Monday to get ahead on things. I'm leaving Monday afternoon.